Countless battles had been won by Alexander the Great by now during his Persian campaign, as he had crossed the Hellespont and marched through Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gate to finally arrive in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, in the Persian capital of Persepolis. Persia was now firmly in Alexander's grip, but Darius III, king of kings of the Achaemenid Empire, had been able to escape him at every battle. As Alexander had been informed that Darius was in Media, he followed his trail northwest to the city of Ecbatana, which surrendered to him without a fight in June 330 BC. Darius, however, withdrew his troops to Bactria, where he could reinforce his army and make better use of his cavalry in the vast plains of Asia. But as he reached Bactria, he was betrayed and captured by the Bactrian satrap Bessus, who, like many others, had, after the numerous defeats, lost his confidence in his strategic ability. Bessus then sent messengers to Alexander to offer him Darius in exchange for the freedom of Bactria. Alexander, however, did not respond to these negotiation attempts and instead continued his hunt for Darius, determined to finally get hold of him in order to remain, after his and Bessus's capture, as the sole ruler of Persia. Bessus, who soon realized that his attempts to negotiate would lead nowhere, and that Alexander would not rest until the entire Achaemenid Empire was conquered, in his desperation tied Darius to a wooden carriage and wounded him with his spear to leave him for dead in the desert. Here he was not long after found dead by Alexander, who had him transported to Persepolis, where he was buried in dignity, just like the Persian kings before him. In order to secure the support for the Persians and their nobles, Alexander now called on them to take revenge against Bessus, who had now given himself the title of King of Persia. Countless Persians followed his call, including Darius's brother Jaxartes. The Macedonians and Greeks, however, were far from enthusiastic about avenging King Darius with enemy Persians at their side. Nevertheless, in 330 BC, they set out on a campaign against Bessus, first passing through Hyrcania, which they conquered easily. Afterwards, however, they left the direct route to Bactria, and thus Bessus, but turned off to Arrhaea, where they succeeded in taking over the capital Artacoana, which was subsequently renamed to Alexandria Arion. His campaign led him over the Alexandria Arachosia and further along the river Tarnac, where, in the year 329 BC, he finally reached the foothills of the Hindu Kush. The inhabitants of the Bactrian capital Bactria, who had learned that Alexander was about to cross the Hindu Kush, banished Bessus, who then fled north towards Sogdiana. Alexander had meanwhile begun the arduous crossing of the Hindu Kush, which many, due to the longer periods of hunger and thirst, would not survive. Furthermore, many of the Macedonians had previously been assigned to guard the conquered satrapies, so as the Greeks finally arrived in Bactria, only about half of the former 50,000 soldiers remained, which was, however, surrendered to them by the Bactrians without a fight. Alexander did not stay long in Bactria and continued to follow Bessus, who had fled northwards to the Oxus River. The long march through the waterless desert, however, ended disastrously for many, and Bessus's order to slow down the Macedonian advance had destroyed all the ships at the Oxus River. Bessus's plan proved to be successful, as it took the Macedonians a few days to assemble the necessary rafts and cross the Oxus River into Sogdiana. But Bessus's luck ran out. His soldiers, who were tired of fleeing from Alexander, mutinied under the leadership of the Sogdian satrap Spitamenes. They captured him and handed him over to Alexander. Alexander, without mercy, had Bessus's nose and ears cut off, and then handed over the mutilated man to Darius's brother Jaxartes, so that he could take him to Media, to the place where Darius had been murdered. There, Bessus was crucified. From there, Alexander marched his men deeper into Sogdiana, and only a little later, its capital Maracanda passed to Alexander. Now, all the satrapies of the former Achaemenid Empire were firmly in Alexander's hands, and no one but Alexander held any claim to the throne of Persia. From Maracanda, Alexander now intended to fight Spitamenes. Fighting Spitamenes, however, should prove to be much more difficult than expected, as danger no longer only awaited him from the remaining Sogdian rebels. North of the Jaxartes River lived a Scythian tribe called the Saka, who had been a constant threat to the Sogdians. Being well informed about the situation in Sogdiana, they now realized that they could plunder the satrapy by defeating the Macedonians. And as a result, about 15,000 horse archers gathered under their leader Jaxartes on the northern bank of the Jaxartes River. In order to confront the impending danger, Alexander instantly gathered his troops and left Maracanda to face the Scythians to the north. But in this way, he renounced a direct campaign against Spitamenes, which he immediately took advantage of. Spitamenes, together with the Sogdians, who slowly realized that their foreign rule had only been replaced by another, succeeded in liberating themselves from the Macedonian occupiers in many cities and started a full revolt. Alexander's answer was merciless. On his march to the Jaxartes River, he succeeded in conquering a mind-blowing 5 cities in just 2 days, and went on to capture 2 more, including the city of Syropolis, named after the Persian king Cyrus the Great. In every city Alexander conquered, he executed a large portion of its male population. But Spitamenes had, in the meantime, begun to besiege the capital Maracanda, and Alexander was now in serious trouble, as he could hardly spare any warriors against the battle-hardened, numerically superior Scythians, but finally dispatched a relief force of 2,300 men under the leadership of Farnuches to Maracanda. Alexander marched his army further to the river Jaxartes, where he founded the city of Alexandria Eschate, called the Furthest Alexandria in English, in order to protect Sogdiana from the Scythian invasions, just as Syropolis had done. During the construction of the city walls, they were repeatedly bombarded by the Scythians with rains of arrows. However, the range of their bows was not quite enough to reach them. It took 17 days until the city wall was high enough, and Alexander finally decided to face the Saka. Then Alexander ordered his men to procure enough boats so that all could cross the Jaxartes together, in order to give the Scythians enough targets for their bows. The Scythians already awaited the Macedonians on the opposite shore to beat them in detail, but Alexander the Great was aware that a landing without adequate cover would mean a suicide mission, and as the Greek bows could not shoot far enough to reach the other shore, he ordered his artillery to get in position and take the Saka under fire. Alexander's use of artillery proved to be a complete success. The stones and missiles of the Greek artillery not only easily reached the other shore, but also caused first losses, and when one of the Saka leaders was mortally hit, they were forced to fall back and let the Macedonians land on the northern shore of the Jaxartes. First, Alexander ordered his archers and slingers to disembark in order to keep the Scythians at a distance and to allow a controlled landing of the remaining troops. They were followed by mounted spearmen, and when Alexander noticed that the Scythians had retreated even further, he instantly dispatched them to force a decisive battle, and thus eradicate the threat to his borders from the nomad armies once and for all. The well-trained cavalry was aware of the nature of this sacrifice, but they trusted in Alexander's strategic skill. Alexander's plan seemed to work for the time being. The Scythians immediately attacked the Macedonian cavalry in their usual encirclement tactics, paired with continuous arrow fire, and thus were bound, but on the other hand inflicted great losses to the Macedonian cavalry. Alexander the Great now ordered the advance of his Cretan archers, who were to take the distracted Saka horse archers under attack. At the same time, he ordered his light cavalry, who had just landed on the riverbank, to attack the Scythians from the flank. He himself advanced with his companion cavalry from the center. The Cretan archers managed to plunge the mounted Scythians into chaos, who subsequently suffered heavy losses from the companion cavalry. In this battle, their leader Jaxartes was mortally wounded and died shortly after. When the remaining Scythians saw what had happened to their horse archers and leader, they fled from the battlefield. whereupon Alexander with his cavalry contingent followed them. But after a short while he had to give up his chase, as he had drunk from the Jaxartes and now suffered from severe diarrhea. The Saka had suffered many casualties that day. Over 1,200 men lay dead on the battlefield, and more than 150 had become prisoners of war. But when Alexander the Great returned to Alexandria Eshet, he handed them over to a Scythian delegation in return for their promise never to invade Sogdiana again. Now the danger of the Scythians was banished, but that of the rebel Spitamenes remained, who in the meantime had taken Maracanda and completely annihilated Alexander's relief force under Pharnuches. As a result, Alexander moved south with his remaining army and captured Maracanda again, but Spitamenes escaped. However, since Alexander's army had suffered many losses, he was forced to abandon his chase and retreat to Bactria once again in the winter of 329-328 BC. On his way south, he made sure to burn down all the fields of the peasants who had supported Spitamenes. After arriving in Bactria, reinforcements from the west arrived, and in the spring of 328 BC, Alexander was already able to return to Sogdiana. Here, the Sogdian rebels resisted him for an entire year, but finally were defeated by Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gabai, where they turned against their leader Spitamenes, cut off his head, and sent it to Alexander, which essentially concluded Alexander the Great's long campaign in Sogdiana and Bactria. Now, after many months quelling revolts, he can finally turn his attention back to conquest.